Badass woman in Herstory. Margaret Heffernan Borland, born April 3rd, 1824, passed July 5th, 1873, was a pioneering frontierswoman who ran her own ranch, as well as handled her own herds. She made a name for herself as a cattle baron who was famous for the drive of Texas longhorn cattle that she took up to the Chisholm Trail from Texas to Wichita, Kansas, with her 3 surviving children and her granddaughter. To date, she is the only known woman in the history of the United States to run her own cattle drive and was considered one of the first cattle queens after being widowed thrice. Early life. Margaret Heffernan was born to Irish immigrant parents on April 3rd, 1824 in Ireland. Her parents were born there as well, but they sailed to America and arrived in New York City when Margaret was 5. Her father was a candle maker who moved to Texas after he was having a hard time making ends meet. In 1829, when a land agent told Margaret's father about money opportunities in Texas, the Heffernans moved west to find fortune. The government was offering incentives as well to families that supplied their own tools and were able to sustain themselves for a year. If a family was able to do that, the government would give a yoke of oxen, a cart, 10 milking cows, and a league of land. In addition, the family was required to practice Catholicism and to speak Spanish for business purposes. Margaret was 9 years old when she arrived in Texas. The family was part of the McClellan-McLoin colony that was aiming to place around 200 families into Texas. Once arriving in Texas, the family settled on land that was surrounded by the wild prairies near San Patricio in South Texas. There, Margaret's father fared well with the Texas cattle industry, along with many Irish settlers, as the cattle industry was a common occupation for Irish settlers in the South at the time. Very interesting. Margaret's father died shortly at the hands of José de Urias forces during the Texas Revolution prior to the Texas invasion by Santa Anna. Along with her father and another cousin, her uncle, his wife, and their 5 children were murdered in the same attack. The surviving family fled to a fort at Goliad. The family returned home when news of recent successful campaigns against the Native Americans had reached their camp. Unfortunately, they were only able to be home for a short period before escalating tension with Mexico caused the government to advise residents to move from the area for protection purposes in October 1836. The family went to Brazoria, Texas. The family was there at least 2 years before moving again. Margaret's mother would never remarry, and she died in Victoria, Texas in 1849. Marriages and family life. In August 1843, Margaret married a man named Harrison Dunbar. In the 1840 census, Harrison Dunbar was listed as having 30 head of cattle, which would have set Margaret up for the beginning of her own career in cattle. Margaret gave birth to their daughter, Mary, in 1844, but Harrison died shortly after her birth from wounds he received in a pistol duel. Margaret was only 20 years old at the time. Imagine being 20 and your husband just got shot after you gave birth and he died. Shortly after, in October 1845, Margaret was remarried to a man named Milton Hardy. In the same 1840 census that showed the cattle count for Margaret's first husband, the census showed her second husband had 2,912 acres of land, as well as having 5 additional lots in town. They had 2 children together in the following 2 years. 2 girls, Eliza, who did not survive infancy, and Julia. The couple owned slaves, and in Milton's 1847 will, he made note that a slave he owned named Louisa and her children were to be freed upon his death. In 1852, Margaret gave birth to another healthy daughter named Rosa. That same year, Milton contracted cholera during an epidemic that also killed their young son, William, and he died on August 24th. Milton had 1,200 heads of cattle at the time of his death. Louisa was not freed according to Milton's will, and she was forced to continue to care for Margaret's children and future children, where she was known to them as Mammy. Poor Margaret was married for the third time to a man named Alexander Borland on February 11th, 1856. In 1858, Alexander participated in Victoria's first annual livestock exhibition. By the 1860 census, the couple had amassed the largest herd of cattle in Victoria, a number of 8,000. Additionally, they had together 3 boys and a girl named Nellie. The Civil War gave the Borlands access to millions of cattle that were free roaming in Texas due to many ranchers leaving their farms to fight for the Confederate States Army. By 1867, the Borlands opened their own store, but Alexander was not well. Since he had the money, Alexander spent it to see a surgeon in New Orleans, hoping to receive the best medical care. Alexander never returned to Victoria and died in New Orleans, leaving Margaret a widow for the 3rd time in her life. For Margaret, the tragedy did not stop there for her and her family. In the summer of the same year of Alexander's death, yellow fever was spreading across Texas. The town of Victoria was not spared during this time, and the first casualty for the family was Margaret's daughter, Rosa, who was only 15 at the time of her death. Margaret's firstborn, Mary, was next, and shortly after Mary died, her infant son died as well. Margaret's daughter, Julia, who was 19, and the new mom herself, also succumbed to the illness. Julia's husband, Victor Rose, who almost perished himself during the epidemic, left their daughter named Julia Rose with Margaret so she could raise her. With all of her children from her first 2 marriages now dead, Margaret began to bury her children from her most recent marriage. William was only 6 years old when he died in the same epidemic. By the time the epidemic ended with the cooler winter temperature setting in, Margaret only had 3 surviving children out of the 9 she birthed. Her son-in-law, Victor Rose, went on to become a writer, editor, and historian, where he wrote about Margaret from an intimate perspective, so we are able to gain some insight as to who she was from someone who knew her personally. Victor said this of Margaret in the local newspaper, the Victoria Advocate: a woman of resolute will and self-reliance. Yet, she was not one of the kindest mothers. She had an unaided, acquired a good education, her manners were ladylike, and when fortune smiled upon her, at last in a pecuniary sense, she was perfect at home in the drawing room of the cultured, as if refinement had engulfed its polishing touches upon her mind and maidenhood. Imagine writing that about your mother-in-law. Interesting. Cattlewoman. After the death of Alexander, Margaret took on full responsibility for purchasing and selling her cattle. She had previously worked with Alexander handling the cattle and therefore had a fair understanding of how to run her ranch. She did receive help from slaves, relatives, and farmhands when it came to the actual physical labor required to manage and maintain the herd. Her brother James Heffernan stayed with her and her family and was considered to be a loyal and hardworking man who helped his sister during difficult times. She did face hardships still. In the winter of I wonder if she would have just let Mammy go. She wouldn't have all this bad karma, but who knows. Her brother James, She did face hardships still. In the winter of 1871 to 72, a freak blizzard struck Victoria and killed thousands of her cattle who froze to death due to the storm. Despite the hardships of the previous years, by 1873, Margaret had over 10,000 cattle. Margaret decided to sell some of her cattle to provide some more income. The problem was that the prices for Texas cattle were about $8 a head, whereas the prices for cattle in Kansas were almost $24 per head. Margaret made the unprecedented decision to be her own trail boss and to drive her cattle over the Chisholm Trail to Kansas. To do this meant she needed to take her surviving children and her young granddaughter with her, despite the dangerous road that lay ahead for them all. At the age of 49, Margaret made the decision to take her family and 2,500 cattle to Wichita, Kansas, in search of opportunity and fortune. Her bravery and courage to be the first woman to undertake this effort made the local newspapers and made her name well known in the South as well as the rest of the United States. Trail boss on the Chisholm Trail to Kansas. The family set out for the Chisholm Trail, which started in South Texas in 1873 with half a dozen hired hands in order to manage the herd of over 2,000 cattle. Margaret had to deal with trail hands that were superstitious and sometimes misogynistic, as they often saw women on the trail as a bad omen for them. It took the group about 2 months to make it from Texas to Kansas. During this time, they traveled at a leisurely pace to ensure the cattle were grazing enough and were not getting overly tired. Losing cattle to hunger and exhaustion was a real concern. They passed through Oklahoma before it was a state and was still considered Indian territory. Although it is possible that the group sold some of their animals to Indian agents to keep danger at bay for supplies, when the group arrived in Kansas, they still had a majority of their herd. In the year 1873, it is believed that around 400,000 Texas cattle total were brought into Kansas. Due to this influx, the cattle market crashed in the later part of the year, and the cattle the Borlands brought from Texas did not earn them the financial gain they had expected. In fact, most cattle drivers who tried their luck in Kansas in 1873 suffered a financial loss. Sadly, Margaret would not make it to see the cattle sold, as she took ill towards the end of their journey and would not be able to make a full recovery. After successfully reaching Wichita, Kansas via the Chisholm Trail, Margaret Borland was taken seriously sick by an illness known as trail fever. It also had been cited as congestion of the brain or meningitis. She ultimately did not recover and died in a boarding house. She never had the chance to sell her cattle before her death. The task was left to her surviving family members and those who she employed. The Wichita Beacon newspaper, now the Wichita Eagle, reported on Margaret's death with the following: "We regret to announce the painful news that Mrs. Borland, the widow lady who came up with her own herd of cattle about 2 months ago, bringing with her 3 little children, died at the Planter House Saturday evening with mania, superinduced by her long, tedious journey and overtaxation of the brain." Duck just flew over my head. Margaret Borland died on July 5th, 1873. She was 49 at the time of her death. Her body was then returned from Kansas to Texas so she could be buried in the state where she started her family and cattle business. Her sons Alex and Jesse brought her gravestone, which reads, "Our Mama, Margaret Heffernan Borland, born April 3rd, 1824, died July 5th, 1873. Gone, but not forgotten. Evergreen Cemetery, Victoria." Very interesting. It sucked that she had slaves, even though one of her husbands wanted her